Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Hello everyone, and as I'm well aware, we are the last thing between you and lunch, so we will move swiftly along and we will go back really to first principles. That's what we're doing to end this forum, to go back to first principles, because we've heard a lot, and we just heard it from President Biden there, about threats facing democracies, be they autocratic regimes, be they from climate change, from the pandemic, but also about internal threats. There's been a lot of soul searching, there's been a lot of introspection. I was struck, I'm sure many of you were, by two senior American senators talking about the threat to American democracy. I think it was Senator Kaine who talked about the need for America to strengthen its immune system, its own democracy, strengthening its immune system. And then, of course, we have the question of democracy around the world, because there's been much focus, of course, on events in Afghanistan, but 2021, according to The Economist, has seen more coups than the previous 5 years combined. If we look at Myanmar, Mali, Guinea, Sudan, all around the world, there seems to be a rolling back of democracy. What's going on? Can we, as the title says, keep the faith in democracy? We're going to discuss that with a very global panel, I'm very pleased to say. I'm going to start over the far end with Rob Bauer, who is the chair of NATO's Military Committee, the most senior military officer in NATO. Iko Ibanga is the founder and director of Pro Health International. It's an organization in Nigeria from where Iko is from that's been working on health projects around the country, providing healthcare, free healthcare to those most in need, especially in conflict zones. We have May El Sadani, who is the managing director of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. She comes at this from the perspective of a human rights lawyer, so she can talk to events in the Middle East. And Stefan Meyer is a German politician from the CSU party. He's currently the Deputy Interior Minister. I think we've agreed that's the best way to describe his role. So we're across the continents and across the perspectives as well. And I'm going to start with you, Admiral Bauer. You're a Dutchman, and I know as someone who's been married to a Dutch woman for more than 20 years, you don't mind direct questions. So what on earth is a military man doing on a panel about democracy?
Actually, I think it is a very normal thing, because I think 3.2 million men and women in uniform in NATO defend our democracy and international rules-based order, day in, day out. And I think the one thing that President Putin and his mates hate about us is that we have friends. So when it comes to NATO, I think there's many things that, despite all the problems in the different nations, where sometimes even half the population against the other half of the population are sort of set up against each other, in the NATO headquarters, day in, day out, on the political and military level, we talk to one another, we try to find solutions through consensus. And it actually works. It's very cumbersome sometimes, it's annoying, it will take sometimes more time than you would like. But the good thing about NATO, if we have 9 months, we will take 9 months. If we have 1 day, we will take 1 day. When 9/11 happened, it was the next day. And the former representative, the former ambassador at the time of the United States. And you have to understand the setting. The table is a little bit like this blue carpet. And on the top of the table, there's the Secretary General. And there I am, only military there, and there's the Deputy Secretary General. And then it's Albania, Belgium, and they go around the table to the United States. And the day after, the Albanian ambassador stood up and said, I want to evoke Article 5. Then the Belgian, then Croatia, in the end, it was the United States ambassador who saw 28 at the time ambassadors stand up and ask for an Article 5 evoke. That was the quickest decision making ever in NATO. So it is possible. And if we have time, we will use that time. And there will be differences, and as in every family, there is differences, but we overcome them. In 72 years, we have reinvented ourselves many, many times. Despite all the problems and the anger and the disappointment of the people of Afghanistan, in 20 years of Afghanistan is not the whole history of NATO. We are 72 years old, and there will be a future for NATO after that.
We will come on to Afghanistan. We don't have 9 months or 1 day. We've got 52 minutes, so I will move on to the others if you don't mind. Iko Ibanga, tell us about your work and democracy in Nigeria. It's a democracy. It's a pretty strong democracy in Africa, isn't it? Tell us how important that is to your work.
Nigeria has been a country in terms of independence from Britain for the last 61 years. And 6 years into our independence, we had the first military coup, all right? And that has been a recurrent issue in Nigeria, military coup after military coup. But for the first time in Nigeria's history, we had a transition from a civilian president to another civilian president. So that was a big deal for us. And so in that sense, there's democracy, and the president is not young. And he has said publicly over and over again that he's handing over power in less than 2 years' time. So we assume that we're going to have a third transition to a civilian president. So that's historic. Nigeria being the largest African country in terms of population, So in a sense, we lead the way in Africa. So we're hoping that if we can stabilize democracy in Nigeria, it should spill over to the other parts of Africa.
And what impact does that have? I mean, you deal very much on the front line of health, but you are having to deal with the security problems that Nigeria faces, in particular in the northeast and the northwest. You have Boko Haram as a big threat.
Yeah.
In terms of the leadership and democracy, what role does that play for you?
Okay. Unfortunately, more civilians have been killed in the last few years under a civilian government than any other time in Nigeria's history. And I think that's because there's a very strong radical Islamic push into Africa. And Nigeria has suffered a lot from that. And differences in opinion, but truly, I think the government can do more. I think the people can do more. So they have been able to do a lot of damage, a lot of killings, a lot of kidnappings. You hear about the kidnapping of young girls in hundreds, not 2 or 3 people at a time. Hundreds of people will be kidnapped at a time and kept for ransom, and that has become more prevalent than it should be. So that's unfortunate, though we have a democracy. There's a threat that if we don't preserve it, it's going to get, taken away again. So it definitely, as a doctor that takes healthcare to the less advantage in these rural areas, you can't go there anymore without military cover, and that's sad, but that's the truth.
Thank you. And May, talking about reversal of democracy, in the Middle East, we saw 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, the Arab Spring, all those hopes. And what we seem to be seeing is a rowing back of some of those democratic gains, even in countries like Tunisia, which were at the forefront of the Arab Spring. I mean, can you set out for us what the overall picture is as you see it?
Of course. First of all, thank you to the Halifax International Security Forum for bringing us all together. It's actually my first time, so it's been a pleasure to connect with many of you. And I look forward to seeing how these relationships pan out over the years. I'll start by kind of painting a picture into the headlines that you might see if you follow the Middle East and North Africa region. You see Tunisia, like you were saying, a country that was hailed for its democratic experiment and trajectory. Unfortunately, in the midst of a constitutional crisis, after the president has consolidated control and is taking steps that are alarming to many of us. Then you look at Sudan, where tens of days ago the military has taken control, exercised a coup, and unfortunately taken the country again off of the path, the transition that was agreed on, in order to stop civilian takeover, which was actually scheduled for November 17, just a few days ago. And then you have the example of Lebanon, a country going through collapse on multiple levels. You look at the economy, governance, accountability, and the international community is wrapping its head wondering what they can do. And so the picture is not a positive one, so it's no surprise to me that the headlines are largely negative. Coupled with many of the themes that have been raised by this security forum. And they've affected the MENA region. When you think of Russian aggression in Syria, that was a game changer for why the Assad regime has regained control. You think of China's investments in countries like Egypt and wonder what that might do down the line. And you look at the issue of climate change, which is going to affect this region in a severe way as a result of desertification, water scarcity, growing population. These are real challenges. And so again, the headlines are no surprise. These challenges are large. The solutions need to be dynamic, but they're also going to take decades, and so we don't hear about them. And so I'd like to kind of quickly juxtapose the picture I've painted with why I see hope in the region. I'll give you some examples, tangible examples from the work that I do. I think first of my friend, Bedr Babou, who is a Tunisian human rights defender, head of Demj, which is the largest LGBT organization in Tunisia. Just a few days ago, he was walking home and police attacked him in the street and brutally assaulted him. And while they were assaulting him, they said, "This is for the work that you do." Instead of turning inward, Bedr collected himself. He worked with his team to put together a legal complaint using the Tunisian legal system. And then he continued to do the work that he did because the LGBT community is counting on them. Another example in the form of Paul Nagar, who is a Lebanese man who used to take his young 2-year-old daughter Alexandra to the 2019 protests in Lebanon and show her the beauty of democracy. And unfortunately, Alexandra's life was taken away as a 3-year-old as a result of the Beirut blast. Instead of turning inward, Paul organized with members of the opposition, and they recently actually just gained a victory, a huge victory in the syndicate elections. And so you have independent individuals who are representing pro-democratic values seeking roles like this, and it's an optimistic kind of indicator for elections that might come later. And then the final example in my colleague, Noura Ghazi, who is a Syrian human rights lawyer, who her husband, Bassel Khartabil, was arrested by the Syrian regime and executed in detention. Instead of turning inward, she again worked to realize his dream to create an organization that would stand with the families of the detained and disappeared, mobilize them, get the issue of accountability in the policy discourse. So these are examples of individuals, but they're not one-off examples. And they're not individuals who are solely working in the humanitarian or human rights space. They're individuals who are presenting alternate visions for the Middle East and North Africa, grounded in a deep understanding of what's going on, and really kind of offering solutions that are dynamic, that are complex, and there are tens and hundreds just like them. And I'll just end with this. When as a human rights lawyer, I engage quite a bit with the family members and loved ones of those who are unjustly detained. And I think of the mom, the sister, the loved one of an Egyptian detainee, for example, who's been arrested for exercising his freedom of expression. And she tells me, this is the most difficult thing I've ever been through. My loved one is in jail. There's no end in sight. But I'm so proud of what he stood for. And I never for a day regret the values that he stands for. If this woman, in the midst of her misery and complex, really extremely difficult situation, has not lost the hope or lost the faith, if you will, then who are we in this room with our power, our access, our influence to lose that faith?
Thanks very much. Lots of inspiring stories. Just before we move on to Stefan Meyer, it's great that you focus on individuals, and that's incredibly important. I wonder, though, about the sort of broader movements that we saw just before the pandemic. It was referenced in an earlier panel. 2019, in many countries, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, were years of protest, and there was a real sense of the public coming out in anger at corruption. And I guess the pandemic was part of the reason those movements were quelled. The street was not open for protest in the same way. What's happened to that sort of energy, anger, would you say?
I would say there's no doubt that the pandemic has had an impact in, unfortunately, kind of slowing the movement. But at the end of the day, the same spirit is very much alive. And I think it's taken time for these movements, these groups to organize in different ways. I don't think you'll see the impact right away, but you have people like Paul, who I mentioned, who are then finding each other and coordinating and thinking about contesting syndicate elections, parliamentary elections, etc. So I think the protest movement allowed people to connect. I think thanks to the power of technology, thanks to the fact that people have identified each other, these connective tissues don't go away. And when governments kind of fail to ultimately deliver on the needs of the people, there are unaddressed needs that linger. And so there will always be space for movement. I'm not saying it's easy. And we could talk a lot about kind of the negatives or talk about solutions, but I think these 2019 protests definitely worth paying attention to and seeing what manifests in these countries down the line.
Thank you. Stefan Meyer, I guess democracy's pretty healthy in your country, and you rather have seen that at first hand recently with your party losing power in the most recent federal elections. And it was notable just following the German election campaign certainly when it was compared perhaps to the American election campaign, that sort of the level of discourse and the way post-election the new coalition is being worked out, and it all seems incredibly civilized. Are you confident? Are there threats to democracy in your country?
Thank you very much. Firstly, I also want to thank the organizers of the Halifax International Security Forum very much for organizing this marvelous event. Really, it's for me, it's also the first time to be here, and it's a gorgeous platform, especially for representatives of like-minded countries, of democratic countries, to share some views and to discuss the important issues. And also, we lost the election 2 months ago. I'm still a tremendous supporter of democracy. And as we heard...
Yeah, that's good.
As we discussed very intensively in the last 2 days, which threats, especially Russia and China pose to the Western countries, I'm still convinced also democracy isn't the best form of governing, and certainly it has failures. But on the other hand, I'm deeply convinced it's the best, still the best form of all others. And certainly democracies are not always the fastest countries. It's complicated, it's bureaucratic sometimes. But on the other hand, I think we have such potentials. When I add the population of the States, of Canada, of Australia, New Zealand, and of the European Union, we are an area of about 850 million persons. And so I'm deeply convinced that we must not be naive towards all the subtle efforts which are undertaken by China and by Russia. But on the other hand, I think we can also be quite self-confident if we stand together, if we are still open for compromises between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. I think we have a fair good chance to compete successfully in the end with China and with Russia. I think there is no need to be too self-critical to democracy. Certainly, we have tremendous challenges to cope with: Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, Mali, still Syria. But I think we still have a lot of strength, not only in economic terms, but also especially in political terms.
What about within the European Union? There have been concerns about a couple of countries in the central eastern of Europe and their commitment to democracy. Does that worry you?
Certainly, this concerns us, especially the development in Poland and certainly also in Hungary. But as I said, I'm deeply convinced if we stand together, we have a lot of potentials. I have the impression, we discussed very intensively the threats posed by China. And I had the chance to travel within the last 2 months to Montenegro, to some Western Balkan countries, to Greece. I have the impression that there is a rethinking in a lot of countries with regard to the efforts of China. So certainly a lot of these countries are members of the 16+1 initiative. They support the Silk Road initiative. But on the other hand, meanwhile, they are quite unsatisfied by China because China not fulfills all the expectations they set. And so I'm deeply convinced we can achieve a lot together, and so I think it's a very prospective theme of this panel that we should still keep the faith, and we have a lot to do if we stick together.
Actually, since you mentioned China, maybe I'll turn to you, Iko. Your country, Nigeria, in relationship with China, is Nigeria able to have a relationship with China and Western democracies and be comfortable with that?
Well, I think recently China has made a lot of push into Africa in terms of giving loans building airports, building railways and all that. And it comes with a price. I don't think they're doing it because they love us. So it's the West. I mean, so Nigeria is like, okay, do we go with the East or the West? And I think we're at a point where we're going with both. And so it's very interesting that the Secretary of State for the US was in Nigeria a few days ago. And I think it's the West trying to say, look, okay, you've gone far enough, come back, that kind of thing. So, but China, I don't think will give up in trying to, for lack of a better word, neo-colonialism. They're trying to colonize Africa.
And I guess it's interesting, you mentioned Secretary of State Blinken's visit. The tone of what he was saying, yes, supporting democracy, but it's a far cry from the George W. Bush spreading freedom and democracy around the world, isn't it? It's a different, perhaps more modest, humble America that's dealing with Nigeria and the rest of Africa now.
Yeah, America has its own internal issues. So, I mean, you can't be as strong as you would like to be when you are dealing with things inside. So America has to become stronger inside to become more powerful outside. And right now, China is powerful in terms of, I mean, they're not playing by the rules. So they're doing things that are just very clear and very unprincipled.
Well, I'm sure plenty of Americans in the audience, and hopefully some will want to come in when we turn to questions, but we do have the top NATO military commander. So I'd like to ask you about Afghanistan, Admiral Bao. I know NATO will be making a formal assessment of the 20 years, but I just wonder, in your personal experience, your observations really about NATO's time in Afghanistan.
I would say that in the beginning, NATO did what it's supposed to do, which is providing security, period. But then the lines blurred, actually. And we started to do things that are, and it was Janice, I think, that she said that the military is not supposed to build a nation or to build democracies. That is other institutions that should do that. And I think the ambitions were becoming higher and higher. And it took a while for all the other players to get into Afghanistan. And then the military by nature is impatient. And we are on the ground and we see what is necessary. And then we started to do the military things that were actually not in the military realm per se. And I think if you look at the lessons learned process that we are conducting, it is actually interesting because we are the only ones doing that. EU not, United Nations not. There's probably a lot ongoing in the different nations that did something in Afghanistan. But as a multilateral organization, NATO is doing it. And we have to be careful not to be harsh to ourselves, because if we do that, the only one that will benefit from that is our adversaries. And so we have to be honest, and there will be lessons learned. And one of them is that the mission became larger and larger, and actually the military was not supposed to do that. That is one important lesson, I think, that will come out of the discussions.
So for you, you're the person who gives advice to political leaders about what's possible, don't you? I mean, where does that take you and that kind of advice you'll be giving in the future?
That's a very good point. I think if it comes to the ambitions, that's policy. That's politics for you. And the military advice should be unfettered and should be about what is achievable with the military. And then, of course, when the lines became blurred was that a lot of initiatives were taken into the mission. For example, the provincial reconstruction teams were taken into the mission. And in itself, that was not bad. But if you look at the construct of how development cooperation and how diplomacy money was distributed in Afghanistan, it was through the nations that had a responsibility in a province. And then in that province, NATO had part of it, which was the security. But then nations would provide the operation, the diplomatic efforts and the development efforts. It was not the commander of NATO mission that could say, I want to do less development in Kandahar and more in Uruzgan. Then the nations would say, who are you? It's our money. So although it became part of the mission, it was not really part of the mission, and that's where the blurring of the lines occurred.
Stefan, perhaps I can bring you in at this point as one of the countries involved in this. I mean, how much reflection is going on in Germany?
There must be done a lot of reflection. Certainly, we must assess and must evaluate very intensively the development in Afghanistan within the last years. And to be honest, we were astonished tremendously by this rapid move of the Taliban and of the spread out of the Taliban within Afghanistan. So certainly mistakes were made. This must be outspoken very clearly. And yeah, I think we will, in the opposition now, we will push forward these reflections very intensively in order to prevent that such failures occur again.
And May, you talked earlier about the sort of internal situation, if you like, in the Middle East, but obviously withdrawal from Afghanistan is part of a broader pivot in terms of Western priorities away from the Middle East, Iraq as well, of course. I wonder how that is being viewed in the region and what impact that's having on democracy there.
I think there's a two-pronged answer, if you will. I think certainly to some extent you will find those who perhaps celebrate the withdrawal of military intervention or maybe are against various interventions, but each country is different. And I think it's important to contextualize that and understand kind of where that response might be appropriate more than others and what it would look like also, because military interventions are different. But I think the bigger question for me is not the boots on the ground, but the withdrawal of interest almost in the Middle East, the almost Middle East and North Africa fatigue, if you will, that these are helpless, hopeless societies in which democracy will never take hold. Democracy, they're not made for democracy. Some of these extremely problematic and frankly Orientalist conversations, when in fact democracy, transparency, accountability, justice are universal values and every human being is deserving of them. And in fact, when you look to movements that originate from and in the ground, these are the values that they espouse, not because the United States or Europe told them to, but because this is what it means to be human and this is what human dignity looks like. And so many fear that the withdrawal and sort of the waning support for democracy or kind of the democratic regression globally will affect the situation in the Middle East. I always think of the words of the Egyptian activist Ala Abdel Fattah, who's in prison right now because he exercised his freedom of expression, and he's been in prison for much of the last 10 years for his support of the January 25 revolution. When asked, what can we do as pro-democracy governments to support your movement? He said, fix your own democracy. Because when we fix our own democracy, we put forward a model that can then be adapted, implemented, engaged, personalized, fitted. But we also then make it that much more difficult for autocrats to then say, well, look at what's happening in the United States. How are you then coming to tell us that? So I think withdrawal of interest and withdrawal of engagement from the Middle East and North Africa is really worrying, because I think there are pro-democratic individuals, organizations, movements on the ground, and they should be part of our pro-democracy community. I realize it's a little bit, it's not the traditional kind of state-to-state relationship, but at the end of the day, these civil society advocates, these protest movements, these politicians are the ones that will be the future of the region. The region's median age is 26.8, 27 years old. That's a young region. And so if I'm telling you that the young people and many around them are kind of in support of these values, then we should be thinking long-term, and instead of withdrawing from the region, thinking of ways to support young people, for example, through the creation of fellowships and scholarship opportunities that allow for exchange, support immediately and long-term civil society, think of long-term investments like what we can do to support accountability movements, whether it's improving our own laws to allow for perpetrators to be held to account, or as was mentioned earlier, things like use targeted human rights sanctions and anti-corruption sanctions like the Magnitsky Act to hold perpetrators to account and make them persona non grata in places like the United States and Canada and Europe. There's so much that can be done beyond what's already been done. And I think we're unfortunately going in the wrong direction when the region is suffering from many of the same themes that we continue to talk about here.
Stefan, fatigue with the Middle East? I mean, is that something that's felt in Germany, in the German political sphere?
I wouldn't call it fatigue in the Middle East or in Northern Africa. But I want to underline that certainly this is a very crucial point. We must not leave Afghanistan alone. And I hope, and I'm very much convinced that also the new federal government of Germany will stick to this strategy to help Afghanistan in a humanitarian way. And we must not do the same mistakes we made in Syria in 2014, 2015. When the Western world failed. And the consequence were a tremendous influx of Syrian refugees and migrants to Europe. And I'm deeply convinced that we certainly history doesn't repeat itself, but I think we must be very careful. And so we announced already, the actual federal government of Germany, that we will invest 100 millions of euros in order to stabilize the region, Afghanistan on the one hand, but also the neighboring countries, Pakistan, also Iran. I think this is also necessary. And certainly we must deal in a certain way also with Turkey. Turkey is a very crucial and very important country, especially with regard to its strategic role. So, and we also must always be aware that Asia doesn't consist only of China. I'm deeply convinced that I mentioned the threats posed by China to the Western world. I think we have a rather big chance to cooperate more intensively with other Asian countries like Japan, like Vietnam. Vietnam is doing a marvelous development within the last years, or South Korea, Taiwan. So I think also we have withdrawn our military from Afghanistan. The Western world needs to set a clear political signal in order to enhance the cooperation with the Middle East and with Asia outside China as a whole.
Ika, if I can come back to you and your sphere of health and turn to the pandemic, because in terms of how democracies or various countries have used vaccine diplomacy and whether or not they have delivered on their promises of vaccines to Africa in particular, which still has a very low percentage of its population vaccinated. What's your perspective on that, and what difference that is going to make to the way African countries perceive democracies versus China, Russia, for example?
Okay, the vaccines in Nigeria right now mainly came from the West. And only 2% of the population have been vaccinated. So it's really not an issue of more vaccines. It's just there's a big resistance to vaccines in Nigeria and other African countries. And it all has to do with the culture, misinformation. And so that's actually a bigger challenge to deal with, the resistance to vaccination. I mean, historically, you know, there was an issue with polio vaccine in northern Nigeria that led to, quote, the death of children. And from there they thought, oh, if you get vaccinated, you're going to become infertile, you're not going to be able to have children and stuff like that. So there's a big issue of trying to educate the Nigerian population. In fact, MasterCard Foundation is pumping in billions of dollars to try to get people to accept to be vaccinated. And so
it's not supply.
It's not the main issue is not supply, truly.
So how are you? I mean, this clearly is nothing new to you. I mean, in your role, are you having to be educator to change minds? What do you do?
We were talking with someone yesterday that the biggest way to communicate in Africa is through radio. So there needs to be a very intentional drive.
Fine medium.
By, you know, to just try to get people to think, look, this is not going to kill you. And truly, I mean, for example, there's a grant that as an NGO we're applying for to try to move from 2% to 60% in the next 2 years. And we know that we'll try to move it, but I don't think we're going to be able to move it to 40% or 30%. So that's a reality. Well, the other good thing, and I'm saying this is good, is that the death rates in Nigeria or Africa is not as high as expected. And there are different theories for why it's not so high. First of all, it's a young population. And secondly, we probably think there's some relationship between resistance to viruses and recurrent malaria infestation. Okay, it's not totally proven. But for a number of good reasons, we haven't died like they thought we would die. So in that sense, it's a good thing.
Yeah, good thing indeed. We've just got 20 minutes or so. I think, mindful this is the last session and people possibly have questions. I think maybe at this stage we should turn to questions, give people as much chance as possible. I can see plenty of hands. Let's, gentleman at the back there, and then lady here. Should we do two or three at a time? Yeah.
Thanks very much. I'm Matt Breiser from the Atlantic Council. To what extent did the events in the U.S. on January 6th really hamstring the U.S.'s ability to lead on democracy? You've touched upon it, and especially in resisting China when we have fellow members of the transatlantic community that are hesitant to push so hard on China as much as the U.S. is.
Well, should we start with that? Maybe Admiral?
Yeah.
Who would you like to take that one?
Well, in NATO, there's a clear distinction between Russia and China with regard to how we look at the two nations. Russia is an adversary and China is a challenge. Now, it's two words, but the difference is that with an adversary, you actually have to plan against it because the adversary might take steps against the alliance, and then you have to have, amongst others, military plans to basically make sure that that is not successful. That happens through deterrence and defense. Deterrence, if you have to explain that to someone, I would say, is the 7 feet bouncer at the club. And when you try to get in, and the club is NATO, if you try to get in, you look at him and you think, maybe not. But the bouncer at the same time needs to be able to really work against the person that tries to get in if it's necessary. But you actually hope together, and deterrence is not only military, deterrence is in the economic field and financial, and there's all sort of political, there's also sorts of forms of deterrence, but in terms of military, it's the 7 feet bouncer. And then if it's necessary, you need to defend yourself. Now, with China, we see China as a challenge because there's a couple of domains. I mean, there's 5 domains now: land, air, maritime, space, and cyber. In the cyber and space domain, we actually see China very active, also in the alliance, because there's no geographical boundaries there. But in the other domains, it is not as much felt as the US feels it in the Indo-Pacific, for example. So there is a difference in the approach between nations. I mean, there might be other allies that have another approach towards China than what the NATO approach is, because NATO looks at it at 30. We have to agree at 30 to come up with a plan. So that is the main difference between the two.
7 feet bounce, that's fairly short by Dutch standards, isn't it? Probably. But with due
But the
respect,
Chinese and the Russians are shorter.
with due respect, I'm going to ask the follow-up, because you didn't really answer that question, did you, Admiral? Which was, has America, the problems America has had on January the 6th, has that undermined NATO's ability to...
Yeah, and I'm not shying away from the answer, because actually the answer in the military realm is no. There's no effect. And I would say that, and we all know this example where General Milley walked with President Trump towards this church, and the Bible was shown, and he actually thereafter went to the armed forces in the United States and apologized for him being there. And the reason for that is, and that is extremely important in this discussion with regard to the democracy, the armed forces should by definition be apolitical. We should not become part of the discussion in the political realm. Because if the government changes, the armed forces is the same, and the new government needs to have the ability to rule the nation and direct the nation in the direction that is necessary. Within, I stress, within the rules-based international order and the values that we all adhere to. So, and it is actually a very good example where a military high officer made a mistake, which he publicly said so, send a letter to the armed forces, and actually trust in him as a military leader in the United States was there again. And so, in terms of the military, I don't see there is an issue with the United States having a leading role. Politically, that might be a different discussion. But
this lady here, at the microphone. Thank you.
Thanks. Sabrina from Afghanistan. Well, thank you for the great discussion. I really enjoyed and used it a lot. My point is that I think we do need to set good examples of what we do today to keep the faith alive and keep these little windows of hope for the next generations and next young democracies to grow bigger and older and be positive and have an impact. So please make things that have gone wrong in Afghanistan and make this collective failure correct again. Afghanistan needs urgent humanitarian assistance, as you have mentioned, but we also need you to keep your promises. Do not recognize the Emirat Islamic of Afghanistan as they are the extremist group. Don't let our faith in their hands. I was hopeful when I was seeing what is happening in Middle East that dictatorships are being encouraged to be replaced by democratic governments. I was never ready to see what happened in Afghanistan that will come true, that an extremist group will be replaced with a very young democracy which needed more time to nourish. So if we all want to see democracies grow and hope to still be alive, we have to set good examples. Second, sending your delegations to negotiate on Afghanistan, include women in your teams to be our voices and echo our hopes and dreams. Third, I do believe that we do need to have comprehensive strategies when it comes to any complex situations, but most specifically about Afghanistan's negotiation process needs to be start again over, and we have to come to a political settlement in Afghanistan that we all be included and a part of that if we want the region to be safe and not the concern of expanding global terrorism to be a threat to all of us in the future and make our eyes watered again. So my suggestion for the world leaders, for you that are representing your governments, for those who have served in my country, which I thank you for your service, and if I'm standing today here and I have a voice, and if you see women in Afghanistan on the streets protesting, asking for their rights, women journalists, preparing reports is because of what you have done. It had not been for nothing. We really are appreciative of what you have done, but please make things to, work again. We are ready, but we do need your support. So keep the hope alive by setting a good example of what went wrong in Afghanistan.
Thanks very much, Val. Passionate call to keep the faith there. Now let's have a look at some, I can see a hand at the back there.
Thank you. Cassandra Steer from the Australian National University. And I have a question about a term that I have not heard over the weekend, which is the Asian century. So in Australia and in some universities in Europe as well, political scientists, strategic and defence thinkers quite confidently, not comfortably, but confidently say the American century has ended and we're in the Asian century. And that, as you pointed out, Mr. Meyer, doesn't necessarily just mean China. So I'm very interested in the panel's thoughts on the role of middle countries and smaller nations, since you all come from middle powers and smaller nations, in the role that those nations have in a balanced Asian century, so partnering with Japan, with South Korea, with Indonesia, with these other nations. What role should these nations be taking? It's quite clear, I think, and I do think from an Australian perspective, political, not military, that what happened on January 6th in the US was a bit of a galvanizing moment to say, really, the American century has now ended, that there is a lot going on internally in the US that needs the US's attention. Excuse me, it's a long weekend. And that middle nations and smaller nations have a much greater and important role to play in this multilateral era, in this Asian century. I'm just very curious on your thoughts on that.
Don't know who wants to take that on. Germany, a middle nation? I'm not sure. Well, quite a large nation, really. Nigeria, a very large nation. Yeah. But perhaps, Stefan, you'd take that on.
It's really a very important question or a remark. I have always a little bit a problem to say that this century is an Asian century. Certainly, Asia is a very fast developing continent. There's a huge dynamic in this continent. But at least from a German perspective, I have the impression that I only can speak about Germany. That the German population only sees China, or mainly sees China. And I just want to underline that certainly Asia doesn't only consist of China. So there are a lot of other very rapidly evolving and developing countries. I mentioned a few. And I think there is a lot potential to cooperate much more intensively with those countries. And certainly I'm not naive, and I know that China and also Russia, and I totally agree that both countries must be assessed in a different way. But both countries will conduct their efforts to divide Europe, to divide the European Union, to separate the European unions or different countries. But I'm deeply convinced if all the Western countries are open to make compromises and not only to follow their own national interests, we have a rather good potential to include those like-minded countries in the Asian on the Asian continent with the Western world. So and to not only to concentrate on China or Russia.
Okay, thanks very much. Hand at the back there.
Good afternoon. Tolu Ogunlesi from Nigeria. It was a quick comment about optimism because the topic is keeping the faith. And I know it's easy to sort of sit in the West and think, oh, we're losing out to China, we're losing out and all that. But I think that from the point of view of communications and storytelling, it's important to focus on the things that are being done right. And, in technology, for example, you have Google and Facebook building $1 billion subsea cables to the continent. You have companies like investors like Tiger Global and MasterCard and co putting lots of money into African fintech. You know, in military cooperation, you're seeing a lot of, the biggest deal that we've seen in Nigeria in the last few years has been the sale of Super Tucano by the US government to Nigeria. You're seeing the British, American, and French navies active in the Gulf of Guinea. So I think that it's sometimes important to also focus, I mean, in line with keeping the faith, you know, and optimism, to focus on the things that are being done right. And I think that this focus, when you focus on some of those positives, I suspect that it might inspire more people to do more things, more tech companies, more venture capitalists in the US and in the West, you know, to do more. And the final example I would give is what France is starting to do with Nigeria. Now France is on the move. You know, it's this year there's a French-Nigeria Business Council that was set up, you know, and President Macron is actively pushing away from, I guess, Francophone Africa towards Anglophone. So these examples, but these stories must be told. If we don't tell them, then we assume that it's all, you know, about despair and all about, oh, China is getting the upper hand, but it's not always quite like that. So I just thought I should put that on the table. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Don't know if you want to come in and comment. Well, Ika,
Well, let me start by saying that I fully agree that there's so many initiatives in so many nations where allies are helping in terms from the military nations on a one-by-one relationship. Not necessarily through NATO always, but there's a lot of allies that are having interest and the willingness to help other nations to improve, to train them, to make sure that the system is improving. Which is then also a support for the democracies that they are working for. Maybe on a lighter note, but I think Peter van Praag, I don't see him. Is he here?
Peter Pan.
He'll be here in 2 minutes. Okay. Maybe I should wait then until he's here. But I want to say something about keeping the faith and Peter van Praag later, if you allow me.
I will. I'm sure we'll see Peter soon. The interesting point about tech. And just sort of struck me, you know, there's so much spoken about the role of tech during the Arab Spring and its importance. I mean, what's happening in the Middle East? Is it still an important factor in keep spreading democracy?
I think it's absolutely an important factor. I think there are wonderful stories and there are also examples of weaponization. And I think this is where the role of pro-democracy advocates, countries, tech companies that are willing to do good comes in. Because I think you still very much have the example of tech providing a platform for people to organize, to connect, to mobilize, at times using encrypted software, safe software that makes it easier for advocates to connect at a time when there's quite a bit of surveillance. But on the flip side, you have surveillance tech, which makes it that much more difficult for human rights advocates and otherwise to be able to do so safely and securely. And I think this really drives home how, yes, tech played an important role in the Arab Spring. It played an important role in the years since. It continues to play an important mobilizing role. But at the same time, governments are now catching up and weaponizing it, whether through the misuse of surveillance technology against defenders and dissidents, but also regular monitoring kind of that occurs on the internet, passing of legislation that targets individuals for their social media activity. These are all phenomena we're also seeing. And so I think coordination across country, across region, on the issue of tech is extremely important. I think human rights advocates, civil society should be part of the conversation when tech companies are really thinking, what can we do to make our platforms safer, secure, more effective for mobilization? And on the flip side, I think they can be quite powerful allies of those platform companies as well when the opportunity lends itself. So I think we're at a critical moment. In the last panel, we talked about standards being developed around internet freedom, surveillance tech, et cetera, et cetera. There's quite a lot to be done, and I think the more we invest now, the more opportunity for these standards to really last with us and take us further.
Now, I've probably got time for one more question. I see Peter here because Admiral Bauer had something he wanted to say to you, so we'll...
Yes, please. I think Peter is the personification of keeping up the faith. Because I saw... I don't know whether you've noticed, but if you look at the eyes of Peter now, they are actually quite different from the Friday when he had his first talk to us. You were actually quite somber on Friday. And through this HISF, this beautiful security forum, which you organize, I think you yourself have improved tremendously. And I think... So we actually do this for you to make sure that you keep up the faith. Because I think it is remarkable to see the change in you over the 3 days. And I think for me, it is a fantastic to be able to get together again and to talk with like-minded people. We do not have to agree. That's not necessary. But it is fantastic that we are able to have these discussions of our free will. And that is not possible in all the nations that are not democracies.
It would be churlish of me to take up the remaining 1 minute 15 seconds with anything other than to thank the panel, because that was a perfect end to our discussion. Thanks very much, Admiral Bow, for wrapping things up like a very professional moderator. So much appreciated. And thank you to everyone else on our panel, to Iko Ibanga, to May El Sadani, and to Stefan Meyer. And thank you all for being such a great audience. And I hand over to the man himself, Peter.
Jamie, thank you so much. All of you, thank you so much. Admiral Bauer, really thank you for those kind words. And thank you for NATO's support. And your being here and on this panel was deliberate and I think really significant. So thank you very much. And then I would like to as well thank each and every one of you for making the trip to the 2021 Halifax International Security Forum in person. When we decided to make it an in-person forum, we did, as an organization, knew it was the right decision, and I think it turned out to be exactly the right decision. And we look forward, and I think all of you look forward to a time when we're back to a place where we can sit and see each other's faces, see each other's reactions. And I think that we're going to get there, we're going to get beyond there, and there is a lot of reason to leave this weekend keeping the faith in what we do and how we do it. And so thank you once again, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.
This concludes the program. Lunch is being served in the Atlantic Ballroom.